Waterloo. During the night of the 18th of June on the battlefield of Waterloo, the dead were despoiled. Wellington was rigid. He ordered whoever should be taken to the act to be put to death. But rapine is perversing. The martyrs who were robbing in one corner of the battlefield while they were shooting them in another. The moon was an evil genius on this plan. Toward midnight a man was prowling, or rather crawling along the sunken road of Huain. He was dressed in a blouse which was in part a capot, and was restless and daring, looking behind and before as he went. Who was this man? Night probably knew more of his doings than day. He had no knapsack, but evidently large pockets under his capot. From time to time he stopped, examined the plain around him as if to see if he were observed, and stooped down suddenly, stirred on the ground something silent and motionless, then arose up and skulked away. His gliding movement, his attitudes, his rapid and mysterious gestures made him seem like those twilight spectres which haunt ruins and which the old Norman legends called the goers. Certain nocturnal water birds made such motions in marshes. The night was serene. Not a cloud was in the zenith. What mattered is that the earth was red. The moon retained her whiteness. Such is the indifference of heaven in the meadows, branches of trees broken by grape, but not fallen, and held by the bark swing gently in the night wind. A breath, almost a respiration, moved from the brushwood. There was a quivering in the grass which seemed like a departure of souls. The night prowler which we have just introduced to the render ferreted through this immense grave. He looked about. He passed an indescribably hideous review of the dead. He walked with his feet in blood. Suddenly he stopped. A few steps before him in the sunken road, at a point where the mound of corpses ended, from under this mass of men and horses appeared an open land, lighted by the moon. This hand had something upon a finger which sparkled. It was a gold ring. The man stooped down, remained a moment, and when he rose, there was no ring upon that hand. He did not rise up precisely. He remained in a sinister and startled attitude, turning his back toward the pile of dead, scrutinizing the horizon on his knees, all the front of his body being supported on by his two forefingers, his head raised just enough to peep above the edge of the hollow road. The four paws of the jackal are adapted to certain actions. Then, deciding upon his course, he arose. At this moment he experienced a shock. He felt that he was held from behind. He turned. It was the open hand which had closed, seizing upon the lappet of his capot. An honest man would have been frightened. This man began to laugh. "Oh," said he, "it is only the dead. I like a ghost better than a gendarme." However, the hand relaxed and let go its hold. Strength is soon exhausted in the tomb. "Aha," returned the prowler, "is this dead man alive? Let us see." He bent over again, rummaged among the heap, removed whatever impeded him, seized the hand, laid hold of the arm, disengaged the head, drew out the body, and some moments after dragged into the shadow of the hollow road an inanimate man, at least one who was senseless. It was an officer also of some rank. A great gold epaulet protruded from beneath his cuirass, and he had no casque. A furious saber cut had disfigured his face, where nothing but blood was to be seen. He did not seem, however, that he had any limbs broken, and by some happy chance, if the word is impossible here, the bodies were arched above him in such a way as to prevent his being crushed. His eyes were closed. He had on his cuirass the silver cross of the Legion of Honor. The prowler tore off this cross, which disappeared in one of the gulfs which he had under his capot. After which he had felt the officer's fob, found a watch there, and took it. Then he rummaged in the vest and found a purse which he pocketed. When he had reached this phase of the succor he was lending the dying man, the officer opened his eyes. "Thanks," he said feebly. The rough movements of the man handling him, the coolness of the night, and the breathing of the fresh air freely had roused him from his lethargy. The prowler answered not. He raised his head. The sound of footsteps could be heard on the plain. Probably it was some patrol who was approaching. The officer murmured. There were still signs of suffering in his voice. "Who has gained the battle?" "The English," answered the prowler. The officer replied, "Search my pockets. You will there find a purse and a watch. Take them." This had already been done. The prowler made a pretense of executing the command and said, "There is nothing there." "I have been robbed," replied the officer. "I am sorry. They would have been yours." The step of the patrol became more and more distinct. Somebody is coming, said the prowler, making a movement as if he would go. The officer, raising himself up painfully upon one arm, held him back. You have saved my life. Who are you? The prowler answered, quick and low. I belong, like yourself, to the French army. I must go. If I am taken, I shall be shot. I have saved your life. Help yourself now. What is your grade? Sergeant. What is your name? Thénardier. I shall not forget that name, said the officer, and you remember mine. My name is Pontomercy. Page 140. The ship Orion. 1. We shall be pardoned for passing rapidly over the painful details. We shall merely reproduce an item published in the Journal de Paris some few months after the remarkable events that occurred at M. An old convict named Jean Valjean has recently been brought before the Var Assizes under circumstances calculated to attract attention. This villain had succeeded in eluding the vigilance of the police. He had changed his name, and he had been adroit enough to procure the appointment of mayor in one of our small towns in the north. He had established in this town a very considerable business, but was at length unmasked and arrested, thanks to the indefatigable zeal of the public authorities. He kept at his mistress a prostitute, who died of the shock of the moment of his arrest. This wretch, who was endowed with Herculean strength, managed to escape. But 3 or 4 days afterward the police retook him in Paris just as he was getting into one of the small vehicles that ply between the capital and the village of Montfermeil, Saint-Haute-Aussi. It was said that he had availed himself of the interval of these 3 or 4 days of freedom to withdraw a considerable sum deposited by him with one of our principal bankers. The amount is estimated at 600,000 or 700,000 francs. According to the minutes of the case, he has concealed it in some place known to himself alone, and it has been impossible to seize it. However it may be, the said Jean Valjean has been brought before the assizes at the department of the Var in the indictment for an assault and robbery on the high road committed vide d'armes some 8 years ago on the person of one of these honest lads, who, as the patriarch of Ferney has written in immortal verse, de Savoie arvid tout le sang, d'étendre le mari et sûr. C'est l'on connaît un roi par la suite. This bandit attempted no defense. It was proved by the able and eloquent representative of the crown that the robbery was shared in by others, and that Jean Valjean formed one of the band of robbers in the south. Consequently, Jean Valjean, being found guilty, was condemned to death. The criminal refused to appeal to the higher courts, and the king, in his inexhaustible clemency, designed to commute his sentence to that of hard labor in prison for life. Jean Valjean was immediately forwarded to the galleys at Toulon. Jean Valjean changed his number at the galleys. He became 9430. Page 142. 2. Very shortly after the time when the authorities took into their heads that the liberated convict Jean Valjean had, during his escape of a few days' duration, been prowling around Montfermeil, it was remarked in that village that a certain old road laborer named Boulatruelle had a fancy for the woods. People in the neighborhood claimed to know that Boulatruelle had been in the galleys. He was under police surveillance, and as could find no work anywhere, the government employed him at half wages as a mender on the crossroad from Gagny to Lagny. What has been observed was this. For some time past, Boulatruelle had left off his work at stone-breaking and keeping the road in order. Very early had gone in the woods with his pick. He would be met toward the evening in the remotest glades of the wildest thickets, having the appearance of a person looking for something, and sometimes digging holes. The worst puzzled of all were the schoolmaster and the tavern keeper, Thénardier, who was everybody's friend, and who had not disdained to strike up an intimacy with even Boulatruelle. He has been in the galleys, said Thénardier. Good Lord, nobody knows who is there or who may be there. So they made up a party and plied the old roadsman with drink. Boulatruelle drank enormously, but said little. He combined with admirable art, and in masterly proportions, the thirst of a guzzler with the discretion of a judge. However, by the dint of returning to the charge, and by putting together and twisting the obscure expressions that he did let fall, the Thénardier and schoolmaster made out, as they thought, the following. One morning about daybreak, as he was going to his work, Boulatruelle had been surprised at seeing under a bush in a corner of the woods a pickaxe and a spade, as one would say, hidden there. However, he supposed that they were the pick and spade of old 6-4s, the water carrier, and thought no more about it. But on the evening of the same day he had seen, without being seen himself, for he was hidden behind a large tree, a person who did not belong at all to that region, and whom he, Boulatruelle, knew very well, or as Thénardier translated it, an old comrade at the galleys, turn off from the high road toward the thickest part of the woods. Boulatruelle obstinately refused to tell the stranger's name. This person carried a package, something square like a large box or a small trunk. 2 or 3 hours later, Boulatruelle saw this person come forth again from the woods, this time carrying now not the little trunk, but a pick and spade. The pick and the spade were a ray of light to Boulatruelle. He hastened to the bushes in the morning and found neither one nor the other. He thence concluded that this person, on entering the woods, had dug a hole with his pick and buried the chest, and had then filled up the hole with his spade. Now, as the chest was too small to contain a corpse, it must contain money. Hence his continued searches. Boulatruelle had explored, sounded, and ransacked the whole forest, and had rummaged every spot where the earth seemed to have been freshly disturbed, but all in vain. He had turned up nothing. Nobody thought any more about it at Montfermeil. 143.3. Toward the end of October in that same year, 1823, the inhabitants of Toulon saw coming back into their port, in consequence of heavy weather, and in order to repair some damages of the ship Orion, which was at a later period employed at Brest as a vessel of instruction, and which then formed part of the Mediterranean squadron. The presence of a vessel of war in port has about a certain influence which attracts and engages the multitude. It is because it is something grand, and the multitude like what is imposing. Every day, then, from morning till night, the quays, the wharves, and the harves. Oh my goodness. Page 144. The presence of a vessel of war in port has about it a certain influence which attracts and engages the multitude. It is because it is something grand, and the multitude like what is imposing. Every day, then, from morning till night, the quays and the wharves and the piers of the port of Toulon were covered with a throng of sentiers and idlers, whose occupation consisted in gazing at the Orion. She was moored near the arsenal. She was in commission, and they were repairing her. The hull had not been injured on the starboard side, but a few planks had been taken off here and there according to custom to admit the air to the framework. One morning the throng which was gazing at her witnessed an accident. The crew was engaged in furling sail. The topman, whose duty it was to take in the starboard upper corner of the main topsail, lost his balance. He was seen tottering. The dense throng assembled on the wharf of the arsenal uttered a cry. The man's head overbalanced his body, and he whirled over the yard, his arms outstretched toward the deep. As he went over, he grasped the man-ropes, first with one hand and then with the other, and hung suspended in that manner. The sea lay far below him at a giddy depth. The shock of his fall had given to the man-ropes a violent swinging motion, and the poor fellow hung dangling to and fro at the end of this line like a stone in a sling. He had to go to his aid was to run a frightful risk. None of the crew, who were all fishermen of the coast recently taken into service, dared attempt it. In the meantime, the poor topman was becoming exhausted. His agony could not be seen in his countenance, but his increasing weakness could be detected in the movements of all his limbs. His arms twisted about in horrible contortions. Every attempt he made to reascend only increased the oscillations of the man-ropes. He did not cry out for fear of losing his strength. All were now looking forward to the moment when he should let go of the rope, and at instants when all their heads away, that they might not see him fall. There were moments when a rope's end, a pole, the branch of a tree, is life itself, and is a frightful thing to see a living being lose his hold upon it, and fall like a ripe fruit. Suddenly a man was discovered clambering up the rigging with the agility of a wildcat. This man was clad in red. It was a convict. He wore a green cap. It was a convict for life. As he reached the round top, a gust of wind blew off his cap and revealed a head entirely white. It was not a young man. In fact, one of the convicts employed on board in some prison task had, at first alarm, run to the officer of the watch, and amid the confusion and hesitation of the crew, while all the sailors trembled and shrank back, had asked permission to save the topman's life, at the risk of his own. A sign of assent was given. With one blow of a hammer he broke the chain riveted to the iron ring at his ankle, then took a rope in his hand and flung himself into the shrouds. Nobody at the moment noticed with what ease the chain was broken. It was only some time afterward that anybody remembered it. In a twinkling he was he was upon the yard. He paused a few seconds and then seemed to measure it with his glance. Those seconds during which the wind swayed the sailor to and fro at the end of the rope seemed ages to the lookers-on. At length the convict raised his eyes to heaven and took a step forward. The crowd drew a long breath. He was seen to run along the yard. On reaching its extreme tip, he fastened one end of the rope he had with him, and the other hang at full length. Thereupon he began to let himself down by his hands along this rope, and then there was an inexpressible sensation of terror. Instead of one man, two were seen dangling at this giddy height. You would have said it was a spider seizing a fly, only in this case the spider was bringing life, and not death. 10,000 eyes were fixed upon the group. Not a cry, not a word was uttered. The same emotion contracted every brow. Every man held his breath, as if afraid to add the last whisper to the wind which was swaying the two unfortunate men. However, the convict had, at length, managed to make his way down to the seaman. It was time. 1 minute more, and the man, exhausted and despairing, would have fallen into the deep. The convict firmly secured him to the rope, to which he clung with one hand, while he worked with the other. Finally, he was seen reascending to the yard and hauling the sailor after him. He supported him there for an instant to let him recover his strength, and then lifting him in his arms, carried him as he walked along the yard to the cross trees, and from there to the round top, where he left him in the hands of his messmates. Then the throng applauded. Old galley sergeants wept. Women hugged each other on the wharves, and all sides voices were heard exclaiming, with a sort of tenderly subdued enthusiasm, "This man must be pardoned." He, however, had made it a point of duty to descend again immediately and go back to his work. In order to arrive more quickly, he slid down the rigging and started to run along the lower yard. All eyes were following him. There was a certain moment when everything felt alarmed, whether it was that he had felt fatigued or that his head swam. People thought they saw him hesitate and stagger. Suddenly the throng uttered a thrilling outcry, and the convict had fallen into the sea. The fall was perilous. The frigate Algeciras was moored close to the Orion, and the poor convict had plunged between the two ships. It was feared that he would be drawn under one or the other. 4 men sprang at once into a boat. The people cheered them on. The anxiety again took possession of all minds. The man had not again risen to the surface. He had disappeared into the sea without making even a ripple, as though he had fallen into a cask of oil. They sounded and dragged the place. It was in vain. The search was continued until night, but not even the body was found. That next morning the Toulon Journal published the following lines. November 17th, 1823. Yesterday a convict at work on board the Orion, on his return from rescuing a sailor, fell into the sea and was drowned. His body was not recovered. It is presumed that it has been caught under the piles at pierhead of the Arsenal. This man was registered by the number of 9430, and his name was Jean Valjean. Page 147. Fulfillment of the promise to the departed. 1. Montfermeil is situated between Livry and Chelles. Upon the southern slope of the high plateau which separates the Orac from the Marne, at present it is a considerable town, adorned all the year round with stuccoed villas, and on Sundays with citizens in full blossom. In 1823 it was a peaceful and charming spot, and not upon the road to any place. The inhabitants cheaply enjoyed that rural life which is so luxuriant and so easy of enjoyment, but water was scarce, and there on account of this height of the plateau. They had to go a considerable distance for it. The end of the village toward Gagny drew its water, and from the magnificent ponds in the forest on that side, and the other end, which surrounds the church, and which is toward Chelles, found drinking water only at a little spring on the side of the hill near the road to Chelles, about 15 minutes' walk from Montfermeil. It was therefore a serious matter for each household to obtain its supply of water. The great houses, the aristocracy, the Thénardier tavern included, paid a penny a bucketful to an old man who made it his business, and whose income from the Montfermeil waterworks was about 8 sous per day. But this man worked only till 7 o'clock in summer, and 5 in the winter, and then when night had come on, and the first floor shutters were closed, whoever had no drinking water went after it, or went without it. This was the terror of the poor being whom the reader has not perhaps forgotten, little Cosette. It will be remembered that Cosette was useful to the Thénardiers in two ways. They got pay from the mother and work from the child. Thus, when the mother ceased entirely to pay, we have seen why, in the preceding chapters, the Thénardiers kept Cosette. She saved them a servant. In that capacity she ran for water when it was wanted, so the child, always horrified at the idea of going to the spring at night, took good care that water should never be wanted at the house. Christmas in the year 1823 was particularly brilliant at Montfermeil. The early part of the winter had been mild, so far that there had neither been frost nor snow. Some jugglers from Paris had obtained permission from the mayor to set up their stalls in the main street of the village, and a company of peddlers had under the same license put up their booths in the square before the church, and even in the lane Bollinger, upon which the reader perhaps remembers the Thénardier chop-house was situated. This filled up the taverns and pot-houses, and gave to this little quiet place a noisy and joyous appearance. On that Christmas evening several men and waggoners and peddlers were seated at a table, and drinking around 4 or 5 candles in the low hall of the Thénardier tavern. This room resembled all bar rooms. Tables, pewter mugs, bottles, drinkers, smokers, little light, and much noise. Thénardier, the wife, was looking to the supper which was cooking before a bright blazing fire. The husband, Thénardier, was drinking with his guests and talking politics. Cosette was at her usual place, seated upon the crosspiece of the kitchen table, near the fireplace. She was clad in rags, her bare feet in wooden shoes, and by the light of the fire was knitting woolen stockings for the little Thénardiers. A young kitten was playing under the chairs. In a neighboring room the fresh voices of 2 children were heard laughing and prattling. It was Éponine and Azelma. In the chimney corner a cowhide hung upon a nail. At intervals the cry of the very young child, which was somewhere in the house, was heard above the noise of the bar-room. This was a little boy which the woman had had some winters before. I don't know why, she said. It was the cold weather, and which was little more than 3 years old. The mother had nursed him, but did not love him. When the hungry clamor of the little brat came too much to hear. "Your boy is squalling," said Thénardier. "Why don't you go and see what he wants?" "Bah!" answered the mother. "I am sick of him." And the poor little fellow continued to cry in the darkness. Page 149. 2. 4 new guests had just come in. Cosette was musing sadly, for though she was only 8 years old, she had already suffered so much that she mused with the mournful air of an old woman. She had a black eye from the blow of the Thénardier's fist, which made the Thénardier say from time to time, "How ugly she is with her patch on her eye." Cosette was then thinking that it was evening, late in the evening, that the bowls and pitchers in the rooms of the travellers who had arrived there must be immediately filled, and that there was no more water in the cistern. All at once one of the peddlers who lodged in the tavern came in and said in a harsh voice, "You have not watered my horse." "Yes, we have, sure," said the Thénardier. "I tell you no, ma'am," replied the peddler. "Cosette, come out from under the table." "Oh, yes, monsieur," said she. "The horse did drink. He drank in the bucket full, and 'twas me that carried it to him, and I talked to him." This was not true. Cosette lied. "Here is a little girl as big as my fist, who can tell a lie as big as a house," exclaimed the peddler. "I tell you that she has not had any water, little wench. He has a way of blowing when he has not had any water, that I know well enough." Cosette persisted, and added in a voice stifled with anguish, and which could hardly be heard, "But he did drink a good deal." "Come," continued the peddler in a passion, "that is enough. Give me my horse some water, and say no more about it." Cosette went back under the table. "Well, of course, that is right," said the Thénardiers. "If the beast has not had any water, she must have some." Then looking about her, "Well, what has become of that little girl?" She stooped down and discovered Cosette, crouched at the other end of the table, almost under the feet of the drinkers. "Aren't you coming?" cried the Thénardiers. Cosette came from under the kind of hole where she had hidden. The Thénardiers continued, "Mademoiselle, dog without a name, go and carry some drink to this horse." "But, ma'am," said Cosette feebly, "there was no water." The Thénardiers threw the street door wide open. "Well, go after some." Cosette hung her head and went for an empty bucket that was by the chimney corner. The bucket was larger than she, and the child could have sat down in it comfortably. The Thénardiers went back to her range and tasted what was in the kettle with a wooden spoon, grumbling all the while. There is some at the spring. She is the worst girl that ever was. I think 'twould have been better if I had left out the onions." Cosette remained motionless, bucket in hand, the open door before her. She seemed to be waiting for somebody to come to aid her. "Get along," cried the Thénardiers. Cosette went out. The door closed. Page 152. 4. As the Thénardier tavern was in that part of the village which is near the church, Cosette had to go to the spring in the woods toward Chelles to draw water. She looked no more at the displays in the booths so long as she was in the Lane Bollinger, and in the vicinity of the church. The illuminated stalls lighted the way, but as soon as the last gleam of the last stall had disappeared, the poor child found herself in darkness. She became buried in it. Only as she became the prey of a certain sensation, she shook the handle of the bucket as much as she could on her way. That made a noise which kept her company. Cosette thus passed through the labyrinth of crooked and deserted streets, which terminates the village of Montfermeil towards Chelles. As long as she had houses or even walls on the sides of the road, she went on boldly enough. From time to time she saw the light of a candle through the cracks of a shutter. It was light and life to her. There were people there that kept up her courage. However, as she advanced, her speed slackened as if mechanically. When she had just passed the last corner of the last house, Cosette stopped. To go beyond the last booth had been difficult. To go further than the last house became impossible. She put the bucket on the ground, buried her hands in her hair, and began to scratch her head slowly, a motion peculiar to terrified and hesitating children. It was Montfermeil no longer. It was the open country. Dark and deserted space was before her. She looked with despair into this darkness where nobody was, where there were beasts, where there were perhaps ghosts. She looked intensely, and she heard the animals walking in the grass, and distinctly saw the ghosts moving in the trees. When she seized her bucket again, fear gave her boldness. "Pshaw," she said, "I will tell her there isn't any more water," and she resolutely went back into Montfermeil. She had scarcely gone 100 steps when she stopped again and began to scratch her head. Now it was the Thénardiers that appeared to her, the hideous Thénardiers with the hyena mouth and wrath flashing from her eyes. The child cast a pitiful glance before her and behind her. What could she do? What would become of her? Where would she go? Before her the spectre of the Thénardiers, behind her all the phantoms of night and of forest. It was the Thénardiers that she recoiled. She took the road to the spring again, and she began to run. She ran out of the village. She ran into the woods, seeing nothing, hearing nothing. She did not stop, running until out of breath, and even then she staggered on. She went right on, desperate. Even while running, she wanted to cry. The nocturnal tremulousness of the forest wrapped her almost completely. She thought no more. She saw nothing more. The immensity of night confronted this little creature. On one side, the infinite shadow; on the other, an atom. The spring was a small natural basin made by the water in a loamy soil about 2 feet deep, surrounded with moss, and with that long-figured grass called Henry Forth's collars, and paved with a few large stones. A brook escaped from it, with a gentle, tranquil murmur. Cosette did not take time to breathe. It was very dark. She was accustomed to come to this fountain. She felt with her left hand in the darkness for the young oak which bent over the spring and usually served her as a support, found a branch, swung herself from it, and bent down and plunged the bucket in the water. She was for a moment so excited that her strength was tripled. She drew out the bucket almost full and set it on the grass. This done, she perceived that her strength was exhausted. She was anxious to start at once, but the effort of filling the bucket had been so great that it was impossible for her to take a step. She was compelled to sit down. She fell upon the grass and remained in a crouching posture. She closed her eyes and she opened them, without knowing why, without a power of doing otherwise. At her side, the water shaken in the bucket made circles that resembled serpents of white fire. Above her head the sky was covered with the vast black clouds which were like sheets of smoke. The tragic mask of night seems to bend vaguely over this child. Jupiter was settling in the depths of the horizon. The child looked with a startled eye upon that great star which she did not know, and which made her afraid. The planet, in fact, was at the moment very near the horizon, and was crossing a dense bed of mist which gave it a horrid and redness. The mist gloomily empurpled magnified the star. One would have thought it a luminous wound. A cold wind blew from the plain. The woods were dark, without any rustling of leaves, without any of those vague and fresh coruscations of summer. Without great branches drew themselves up fearfully. Mean and shapeless bushes whistled in the glades. The tall grass wriggled under the north wind like eels. The brambles twisted about like long arms seeking to seize their prey in their claws. Some dry weeds driven by the wind, passing rapidly by, and appeared to flee with dismay before something that was following. The prospect was dismal. Darkness made the brain giddy. Man needs light. Whoever plunges into the opposite of day feels his heart chilled. When the eye sees blackness, the mind sees trouble. In an eclipse in night, in the sooty darkness, there's anxiety, even to the strongest. Nobody walks alone at night, in the forest without trembling. You feel somehow hideous, as if the soul were amalgamating with shadow. This penetration of darkness is inexpressibly dismal for a child. Forests are apocalypses, and the beating of the wings of a little soul makes an agonizing sound under their monstrous vault. Without being conscious of what she was experiencing, Cosette felt as if she were that she were seized by this black enormity of nature. It was not merely terror that held her, but something more terrible than even terror. She shuddered. Words fail to express the peculiar strangeness of that shudder, which chilled her through and through. Her eye had become wild. She felt that perhaps she would be compelled to return there at the same hour the next night. Then, by some sort of instinct to get out of the singular state which she did not understand, but which terrified her, she began to count aloud, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 10, and when she finished she began again. This restored her a real perception of things about her. Her hands, which she had wet in drawing the water, felt cold. She arose. Her fear had returned, a natural, insurmountable fear. She had only one thought, to fly with all her might, across woods, across fields, to houses, to windows, to lighted candles. Her eyes fell upon the bucket that was before her. Such was the dread with which the Thénardier inspired her, that she did not dare to go without the bucket of water. She grasped the handle with both hands. She could hardly lift the bucket. She went a dozen steps in this manner, but the bucket was full. It was heavy. She was compelled to rest it on the ground. She breathed an instant, then grasped the handle again, and walked on, this time a little longer, but she had to stop again. After resting a few seconds, she started on. She walked, bending forward, her head down, like an old woman. The weight of the bucket strained and stiffened her thin arms. The iron handle was numbing and freezing her little wet hands. From time to time she had to stop, and every time she stopped, the cold water that splashed from the bucket fell upon her naked knees. This took place in the depth of a wood at night, in the winter, far from all human sight. It was a child of 8 years. There was none but God at that moment who saw this sad thing, and undoubtedly her mother, alas. For there are things which open the eyes of the dead in their grave. She breathed with a kind of mournful rattle. Sobs choked her, but she did not dare to weep. So fearful was she of the Thénardier, even at a distance. She always imagined that the Thénardier was near. However, she could not make much headway in this manner. She was getting along very slowly. She tried hard to shorten her resting spells and to walk as far as possible between them. She remembered with anguish that it would take her more than an hour to return to Montfermeil, thus, and the Thénardier would beat her. This anguish added to her dismay at being alone in the woods at night. She was worn out with fatigue, and was not yet out of the forest. Arriving near an old chestnut tree, which she knew, she made at last halt, longer than the others, to get well rested. Then she gathered all her strength, took up the bucket again, and began to walk on courageously. Meanwhile, the poor little despairing thing could not help crying, "Oh, my God, my God!" At that moment she felt all at once that the weight of the bucket was gone. A hand which seemed enormous to her had just caught the handle, and was carrying it easily. She raised her head. A large, dark form, straight and erect, was walking beside her in the gloom. It was a man who had come up behind her, and whom she had not heard. This man, without saying a word, had grasped the handle of the bucket that she was carrying. There are instincts for all the crises of life. The child was not afraid.